Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name's Sephora Berman, and I'm the International Program Director at Stand.Earth, and also the chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. I live and work on the unceded territory of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam First Nations in Vancouver, Canada. Today I'm going to be your moderator as we release this report and have a discussion about the 5 countries that are profiled in the report. As well as a Canadian, I will also speak to the Canadian research. So today we're launching a new report, the Fossil Fueled 5, comparing the rhetoric with reality on fossil fuels and climate change. The report looks at 5 wealthy nations, the US, Canada, Norway, Australia, and the UK, who are planning to approve and subsidize new fossil fuel projects, which undermines their recent claims of leadership in addressing the climate crisis. Pulling from the latest government pledges and speeches, the report shows that these countries have a widening gap between their rhetoric on climate action and their plans to expand the production of fossil fuels. It casts a glaring spotlight on how these countries aren't only hampering progress, but are also ignoring their responsibility to phase out fossil fuels in a way that is fast and fair, despite their historic responsibility and being well-placed to finance the just transition. Yesterday, a group of 12 governments launched the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. Sweden committed to banning oil and gas exploration and extraction next year. So there is an emerging group of countries leading the way. But as we'll hear today from this research, unfortunately, when it comes to the US, Canada, Australia, Norway, and the UK, the opposite is true. For those of us who have been at many COPs over the years, we know that climate policy and climate agreements are complicated. But what's simple is that 86% of the emissions that are trapped in our atmosphere today come from 3 products: oil, gas, and coal. There is no pathway to 1.5 degrees Celsius without addressing fossil fuel production head-on. Right now, we are on track, according to the UN Production Gap Report, to produce 110% more fossil fuels in the next decade than can ever be burned under a 1.5 degree scenario. This paper highlights the hypocrisy of the Fossil Fueled 5 and shows the disconnect between climate pledges and claims of climate leadership on the one hand, and plans to continue and even expand extraction on the other. The paper was produced by the University of Sussex and conducted in cooperation with the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative and key regional partners in each of the 5 countries who are represented here at our press conference. So without further ado, I want to introduce our panelists today. Freddie Daly is joining us virtually. He's currently working as a researcher at the University of Sussex. His academic work focuses on sustainable behavioral change, supply-side mitigation policy, climate justice, and energy transitions. For the initiative, he works as a research coordinator, managing an international team of researchers on the supply-side policy tracker project. Tessa Khan, to my left, is an international human rights and climate change lawyer and campaigner. She's the director and founder of Uplift, an organization helping to move the UK towards a future free from fossil fuel production. She's also an awardee of the Climate Breakthrough Project. Colin Reese is the U.S. program manager with Oil Change International, a research and campaigning organization working to stop the fossil fuel industry and support communities fighting for a just transition. Prior to Oil Change, he helped build the student fossil fuel divestment movement at 350.org and trained youth with Energy Action Coalition. Kaya Nyland is a climate activist from Norway, working for a just transition and phasing out fossil fuels. She's in the steering group of Young Friends of the Earth Norway. Her passion for the environment started with the battle for oil-free areas in Lofoten, where she's from. Kaya is only 19, but has been involved in climate and environmental work for over a decade. Richie Merzin is the Climate and Energy Program Director at the Australia Institute. Richie is a former Australian government representative to the UN Climate Change Conference and worked at the Department of Climate Change and the Department of Foreign Affairs for almost a decade on both domestic and international climate and energy agendas. So first, I want to turn to Freddie, who I believe is joining us. There you are. Hi, Freddie. Thank you for joining us virtually. Freddie is the lead author of this report. So, Freddie, seeing the discrepancies between these countries' talk and walk, consolidated in one place as you've done, is a sobering taste of our climate reality. Give us some of the key takeaways that you want everyone here to leave with from your report.
Thank you, Tesfora. In terms of key takeaways, there's probably two that I'd like everyone to leave here with today. The first is perhaps an obvious one, and that's that net zero pledges cannot be taken at face value, especially now that they have become so mainstream. Reducing domestic emissions is urgently needed and should be welcomed, and countries can be praised on their abilities to do that. But we need to take a step back and look at these emissions reduction pledges in light of fossil fuel production. If countries are curtailing their territorial emissions, but then driving global emissions growth through the exportation of coal, oil, and gas, they must be called out and held to account. The second takeaway is that when it comes to ending fossil fuels and phasing them out, speed is everything. We need to see action and progress now, not in 5, 10, or 20 years. If you take into account equity, the carbon budget is alarmingly small. So speed really is everything. Speed is lives and livelihoods saved. Speed is the rights of future generations acknowledged and respected. Speed is climate justice.
Thank you so much, Freddie. And I'm sure we'll have many questions for you. We are going to take questions after I ask the panelists a couple of questions, so we will come back to you. I want to go to you now, Tessa. Calls to stop Cambo are so incredibly loud, yet the UK is still considering its approval alongside 30 other oil and gas fields before 2025. How does this stack up against the narrative the COP26 hosts have tried to brandish for themselves here in Glasgow?
Thanks so much, Sephora, and thanks so much to the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative for hosting this event, but also more importantly for publishing the report that's underpinning our conversation. To return to your question, in short, it is impossible to reconcile any claim of climate leadership by the UK with its current plans to continue expanding oil and gas production domestically. And it's no coincidence that every time the UK points to its stellar climate record, it keeps the focus squarely on coal and avoids all questions about oil and gas. Because as you said, in addition to the Cambo oil field, which is a massive new oil field that is currently being considered for development just a couple of 100 miles from here, west of the Shetland Islands, there are 30 more new offshore oil and gas projects that are due for approval in the next few years. And there are even more onshore oil and gas developments that are also being considered. The other thing to say in addition to that is that, you know, the UK's entire legal and policy framework is geared towards supporting the interests of the fossil fuel industry. So we have a statutory commitment in this country to maximising economic recovery of offshore oil and gas. That's written into the Petroleum Act, which effectively means that if there is a penny of profit for the oil and gas industry to be made by extracting oil and gas, it is coming out of the ground. The tax regime in the UK is so favourable to oil and gas producers that we are in fact the most profitable jurisdiction in the world for big offshore oil and gas projects. And the tax breaks are such, the subsidies are such, I mean, they're more than, in our estimation, £12 billion just since the Paris Agreement was signed. But that in 2015 and 2016, the tax flows from the industry to the government were actually negative, which is to say that we paid the oil and gas sector more than we received from them in tax revenue. So this is a government and a state that is fully captured by the fossil fuel industry. And that's reflected in the fact that we are continuing to consider expansion of oil and gas, even though the UK government, as COP26 president, commissioned the International Energy Agency to write a report, the IEA's net zero report, which made it clear that if we're going to stay within that critical 1.5 degree threshold, we cannot have any new oil, gas or coal developments. So it is, as I said, impossible to reconcile any claim of climate leadership with the UK government's current approach to oil and gas extraction.
Thanks, Tessa. And I understand yesterday in the text, India had actually proposed including the words oil and gas along with coal in the text of the agreement, and that did not make it into today's draft, in part because of the UK presidency opposing even the words oil and gas appearing.
Yeah, and that is completely consistent with the very noticeable absence of the UK and Scottish governments from the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance initiative, which is, I think for a lot of us, been one of the highlights of this entire 2-week summit, is that recognition by this emerging club of countries that we've got to move away from oil and gas if we're going to, stave off catastrophic climate harm, and the UK government was nowhere to be seen.
So let's move to North America. Colin, the President Biden's election was a major shift, to state the obvious, in climate rhetoric for the U.S. After Trump. Yet progress has been patchy so far. He may have blocked the permit for the Keystone XL pipeline, but now the United States is expected to expand oil and gas more than any other country between 2019 and 2030. So is this another case of empty election promises, or are we seeing a slow start to a wider change?
Yeah, thanks so much, Sephora. I think sad to say that the climate hypocrisy does not stop at the Atlantic Ocean, and that we indeed have a massive problem in both the U.S. and in Canada, as we'll hear about. I think it's probably safe to say that it's a bit of both of those things. Joe Biden is not Donald Trump. That's good. There is some progress being made. And it has done essentially nothing to slow the massive onslaught of oil and gas production facing the U.S. and enabled by U.S. government subsidies and government support. We have seen some important actions by President Biden, like stopping the Keystone XL pipeline, as mentioned. I think it's really important to note that Oil Change International, my organization, just put out a report a few weeks ago showing 23 other projects that Biden could stop with a stroke of a pen, would be equivalent to 1.8 billion tons of CO2 that he could stop tomorrow if he chooses to, and he's not. So these are massive oil pipelines, like the Line 3 oil pipeline coming from Canada, the Line 5 oil pipeline in the U.S., dozens of LNG export terminals in the southern U.S. These are projects that Biden could stop and is choosing not to. And I think that in itself is kind of the core of U.S. hypocrisy on climate. The United States comes to these conferences, it wants to be seen as a climate leader under somebody like Barack Obama, under a Joe Biden. You saw Barack Obama come and give a speech just last week here at the climate talks with no mention of the fact that in 2015, on the eve of the Paris Climate Agreement being reached, he lifted the decades-old crude export ban, which unleashed a torrent of crude oil exports from the United States and has enabled the extraction, the massive expansion of extraction in the Permian Basin region of the United States. This is a part of southeastern New Mexico and western Texas, two parts of the U.S. With some of the single largest carbon reserves to be exploited in the world. The Permian Basin is expected to be exploited over the next decade to its expanding more than 50% in production in the next 9 years if we don't do anything to constrain it. And this is the sort of thing that Joe Biden's administration is very happy to have happen, is actively subsidizing to the tune of billions of dollars a year. And that, I think, is the ongoing extreme hypocrisy in the U.S. approach to climate. Kind words, shifting the blame onto others, while all the while driving immense production of fossil fuels, as you mentioned, the world's leading producer of oil and gas, and I believe soon to be exporter of gas, already the leading exporter of oil. These two things don't match up. One of them has to go, and if we want to save the planet, it has to be the fossil fuels.
I'm finding here at COP that when I speak to countries in the global south, they're quite shocked to find out that it's the U.S. That is planning to expand the most, and in fact, the wealthy countries as a whole planning to expand the majority of fossil fuels. And that's actually why yesterday there was the first discussion here at COP of the first ever global registry of fossil fuel production and reserves, because we have shockingly little accountability and transparency right now on who's producing what fossil fuels and where. That registry is being produced by Carbon Tracker and Global Energy Monitor, and the first prototype will be released in 2022, which I think is important. But while we're on North America, let me turn to the Canada chapter of our research as the Canadian on the panel. Many of you will know that since elected 6 years ago, the Trudeau government has made important strides on climate policy in Canada, such as putting a price on carbon pollution nationwide. Yet Canada's emissions have not gone down. In fact, Canada is the only country among the G7 to have actually increased its emissions since signing the Paris Agreement. This is not helped by the federal government buying the $20 billion Trans Mountain pipeline, which will facilitate the expansion of oil sands production, and of course continuing to subsidize oil and gas drilling at higher levels than any other G20 country. In fact, research by ISD and Environmental Defence Canada has shown us that last year it was about $18 billion in subsidies in Canada to the oil and gas industry. So Canada missed its emissions reduction targets in 2020 under its currently national determined commitment. It's on track to miss its 2025 target too. Canada is still forecasting an increase of 18% for gas production, 17% for oil, above 2019 production levels by 2040, a decade before it's supposed to reach net zero. Canada was among several other countries who last week committed to stop public financing for fossil fuel projects abroad by the end of next year. This is a hugely important development at COP. And it's really important. But that pledge was full of caveats, and it doesn't stop Canada or any of the other countries, the 25 countries who have committed to that overseas financing commitment to stop financing fossil fuel production in other countries. It doesn't stop them from continuing to finance and increase fossil fuel production at home. Any promises on emissions cuts and caps from Canada or any other country will fall short, as long as our political leaders and the oil and gas industry continue to ignore the science, believing we can meet our climate goals without winding down fossil fuel production. This is a significant concern, I think, that we all have about the net zero pledges. Net zero pledges must include absolute emissions and production's decline. And if not, there are huge loopholes in those net zero pledges that are giving countries and companies cover for increasing production and emissions, and justifying that production by saying that we're going to have greater carbon sequestration, either through nature sequestration or for carbon capture and storage, which is completely, in a cumulative way, unrealistic. The math doesn't add up, and carbon capture and storage, which Canada relies on significantly in the Canadian oil and gas industry, is promising will help us reduce emissions, has not proven cost competitive at scale, and has not proven to actually reduce significant emissions despite billions of dollars in investment. So as ministers return to Canada, we need to plan for winding down emissions and production that ensures that we leave no worker and their family behind. We need a plan and target dates for emissions and production decline in order to ensure that we truly do have a just transition. But now I want to turn to Norway. Kaya, Norway's raised their ambition to decrease emissions, but has already granted 60 new licenses for fossil fuel production and access to 84 new exploration zones in 2021 alone. What's your priority ask of the administration right now?
Well, thank you for such a good question. It might sound crazy that we have a government that, despite facing a climate crisis, delivers all these new oil fields that new companies can drill for oil in. Well, the government in Norway has set quite an ambitious emission reduction target. I think it's 55% in 2030 in the reduction in NDCs, which is really good, and climate neutrality by 2050. So, and Norway is pushing here to keep 1.5 alive, but I don't see how we can keep 1.5 alive as long as they're so dependent on their oil. And both the Prime Minister and our Environment Minister are speaking warmly about the efforts Norway are doing here at COP, but their fancy words have little to no value when they back at home are giving out new oil fields. So it's difficult to understand how Norway can have credibility in international climate summits like this when they're so oil dependent and show no interest in or willingness to make a change back home. The production and export of fossil fuels has created a vast amount of wealth for Norway, and the amount of wealth being generated is sufficient enough to get a just transition and to stimulate this deep and rapid shift away from fossil fuels. Still, there are no signs of them wanting to do that. Actually, the Norway's Prime Minister said that a close down of production from Norwegian Shell, it will put a stop to the transition we need to get a green transition. So he believes that if we stop producing oil, we will not be able to get the green transition the world needs, which in my mind sounds strange, and I don't see why this should end the green transition we've had to face. So while Norway's emissions per person are around 7 tons of CO2 equivalents, this excludes the vast impact of our oil and gas exports. So we are reliable on green energy in Norway, but we're exporting most of our oil to other countries and are therefore responsible for a lot of emissions in other countries. So if you take that into account, the numbers that we see in our report now is that Norway's fossil fuel exports emissions skyrocket to 96.3 tons per person. It's from 7 to 96.3. I struggle to, it's not fun to be from Norway when you're at a climate summit because we're so bad. We have such double standards. The world is looking to Norway as a country that is doing a lot of climate change in international summits, but at home we're not doing any efforts. So as you mentioned, in 2020 alone, the government has issued over 60 licenses for new oil fields and 84 new exploration zones. They are in the North Sea, Barents Sea, quite areas that we need to protect also in an environmental view. And these discoveries mean that Norway is actually expected to increase production in the upcoming decade. And much of this fossil production will be exported to other nations, despite the urgency of reducing our global emissions. So we are causing the climate crisis by continuing to drill for oil. And a successful climate agreement is of little value if not all countries do their best to pursue the highest possible ambitions within their own country. And we are moving in the opposite direction of what the world needs. So instead of contributing to ongoing fossil fuel consumption in the world and contribute to the climate crisis, Norway could help facilitate the transition away from fossil fuels. We need to face our fossil fuels now because there really no time to waste.
Thank you so much. I want to turn finally to Richie. Prime Minister Morrison just announced a whopping $740 million to invest in companies that develop low emissions technology, including CCS. How do these announcements lean into this deceptive rhetoric behind some of the country's climate action?
Yeah, thanks for that. It's a good way to lead in, and also just this is a great panel. It's wonderful to be able to talk about fossil fuel supply. And also, I really love the name of this report. It sounds like a team of villains that we have to beat the fossil fuel five. And I think Australia might be the captain of the villains because it's unrepentant whilst the other countries in this Fossil Fuel 5 report are putting forward more ambitious 2030 targets. Australia's refusing to do so because it would know that it couldn't open as many fossil fuel projects as it wanted to if it did so. Currently, there are 100 new fossil fuel projects in the pipeline, over 70 coal mines, 30 gas projects. If they were all opened up to full utility, that's about 1.7 billion tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions. That's 3 times Australia's annual emissions. That's about 200 coal-fired power stations. So Australia wants to sell as much fossil fuels as possible. That's where we're starting from. And just yesterday, the Prime Minister announced another $500 million for carbon capture and storage, which we all know is bullshit. It's been a colossal failure. It's failed upwards, though. It keeps getting more and more money, over $4 billion committed in Australia, not a single clean coal facility, only one for gas that's struggled. But it's really useful for the social license of fossil fuels, to pretend like we can somehow have clean fossil fuels going forward. And that's what the Prime Minister announced, only when he was safely back in Australia, though, not here, because here we know better. Here we know better. We know that if we want to address climate change, we have to address fossil fuels. As Tespora said, it's the main source of greenhouse gas emissions. But here's the problem. The Paris Agreement doesn't mention fossil fuels. It doesn't mention coal, doesn't mention oil, doesn't mention gas. And that's by design, because the dealers don't want it in there, right? Which is so weird, right? If we're addressing weapons, if we're addressing tobacco, if we're addressing drugs, then of course you put restrictions on those who are supplying, the dealers of these problems, but not when it comes to fossil fuels. And that's what we're here trying to change, and that's why COP26 is important. You're actually seeing language on coal. You're actually seeing language to try and restrict fossil fuels for the first time. And that's important, because if you don't, then you're going to blow out the carbon budget. And that's should start with the 5 biggest producers from the West, because they have benefited from industrialization, and they're here to profit from the sale of fossil fuels, not bring their people out of any poverty or any need for electrification or any other excuse they give. And Australia, I think, is the worst because it's unrepentant about doing so. It's so that it sees a bright future for coal and a bright future for gas, is the 3rd largest supplier of fossil fuels in the world, and it wants to continue.
Well, with that, you have an overview of the 5 countries and a little bit of the research that has gone into this report. I think we still have Freddie online as well. So I'm going to open up the floor now for questions. Do we have a mic that we can take around? Thank you. I'll start with one in the back there.
Hello, Felix van Geyer. I'm actually a freelance sustainable development journalist. I've kind of covered the politics of all these countries in my time. So I think one of the things that really gets me is we're talking about the carbon budget, and somehow we seem to be at this kind of net zero for 2050 logic, which I've never quite understood, because the AR5 was basically saying we're going to be at 1.5 by 2022. Then in the 1.5 report, it kind of gave us an extra 5 years, so we'll be there at 2027. We're still talking about net zero by 2050. And you've got these 5 countries who are, especially Australia, I mean, you had the whole neoconservative triangle between Ottawa, Washington, D.C., and John Howard when he was there, trying to really pull apart the United Nations framework in 2007. So how are we really going to move forward? I mean, please, does anyone have a clue?
Who would like to start? While you're gathering your thoughts, I would like to start. So a number of us have been working on this question of fossil fuel supply and looking at what's holding us back. In Canada, for example, production of oil and gas is now the single largest component of our emissions and the fastest growing component of our emissions. Yet, yes, as was mentioned on the panel, while we've been negotiating emissions and targets for 30 years now, the production continues to grow and to lock in further expansion. So how are we going to move forward in all of these countries? We need our countries to commit to production caps, no more expansion of production and decline. What we know is we already have enough fossil fuels under production or construction to take us past 1.5 degrees. So we're spending our financial, our intellectual, and our political capital right now to dig up stuff that we know we can't burn, or it will burn us. And the theory that's been behind climate policy now for decades is that the markets will constrain it, that demand will go down, the price will go up. Renewables, which are now cheaper than fossil fuels in most countries, that therefore the markets will constrain supply. If any of our governments of these 5 wealthy nations have been listening to the vulnerable nations who are already experiencing the worst impacts of climate change today, then they know that we cannot leave the fate of humanity up to the markets. The markets are not constraining production. The theory has not worked, and it's not worked because the markets are distorted by tax breaks and fossil fuel subsidies. And that's why we need governments to act to not only constrain emissions, but to constrain production. We're finally having that conversation at COP for the first time, which is absurd. And that's why a number of us here on the panel and our organizations, as well as 800, 900 now other organizations around the world, 101 Nobel laureates, including the Dalai Lama, yesterday youth groups Fridays for the Future from around the world, and the day before 150 elected members of parliament from 31 countries are all endorsing the idea of a standalone agreement to help us meet the goals of the Paris Accord, a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. Because we need our governments to negotiate who gets to produce and how much, and to cooperate internationally in order to address how, especially countries in the global south, are going to constrain production. Because it's going to require things like debt forgiveness. There are countries right now who are expanding production, like Ecuador in the heart of the Amazon, expanding oil production just to feed their debt. So we need new, bold ideas, and that's currently one of them that's being proposed in order to get us out of this mess. Tessa?
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, I think, you know, I hesitate to sound too optimistic, but I think a lot of us would agree that there is unprecedented momentum at the moment behind addressing this question of fossil fuel supply. And in addition to, you know, what Tzepora's highlighted in terms of the support that's building for a coordinated phase out through a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, I mean, I would point to, I think, 3 other things. The first is increased recognition by, you know, leading research bodies like the International Energy Agency, the UN Environment Programme's Production Gap Report, etc., that make it clear that we can't have any expansion of fossil fuel supply, which, as you've pointed out, you know, the IPCC has dodged that question for the large part in recent years. But we now have these authoritative scientific and academic reports making that point very clearly. The second thing is, I think, the political momentum that we saw a demonstration of with the launch of the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance yesterday does mean that, you know, at the national level, governments are starting to talk about the role that constraining oil and gas has to play in meeting our climate goals. And finally, I think we're finally starting to see the delegitimisation of the fossil fuel industry, certainly in these spaces, for the first time ever. They haven't been invited to the table formally. Of course, they're still here in their dozens, if not in their hundreds, in fact, as lobbyists, but they're not being taken seriously anymore as actors who are partners in the transition. They clearly are holding the transition back. And I think that, you know, in the UK and elsewhere, there is a growing movement to really call out the fossil fuel industry for what it is, which are incumbents that are desperately holding on to a dying industry, and in the process not only sacrificing the most vulnerable communities in the world, but also throwing their workforce, you know, who are heading for deferred collapse of their industry, under the bus. So I really think that those are sort of 3 separate streams that are pushing in a direction that we haven't experienced before.
Thank you, Tessa. You know, I find this, the research that was just done by Global Witness and others to show that there are 100 organizations here. The single largest delegation that is here at COP, twice the number of indigenous nations and indigenous leaders who are here at COP, is from the oil, gas, and coal industry and related associations. That's crazy. You know, the idea that we're continuing to during the climate emergency, invite them into the room as if they're going to design their own demise seems incredibly absurd. I thought Kumi Nadu put it very well in the press conference this morning, where he said it's like we're having a meeting. It's like Alcoholics Anonymous is having a meeting and they invite the liquor industry to tell us what they think, you know. And so, but it is true that it seems to be changing, and at least an acknowledgement at this COP, which could be a tipping point. I'm going to take a couple more questions while we still have time. Yes, please, at the back.
Hello, I'm the junior representative from the China Pavilion, and what I would like to ask is, why do you believe that during this COP26 meeting, there's been such heavy coverage on coal but not oil, even though coal is the top emissions? Oil is not far behind. Countries such as South Africa and China have been at the center of the energy crisis and being blamed, but oil is not very far behind. Why do you think that is? Thank you.
Do you want to take that, Colin?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think this really does get to the core of one of the things that we've talked about, which is the equity involved here. The issue of equity and who is going to act first and fastest, who will have the onus put upon them to make this transition. And I think the countries represented on this stage, the countries represented in this report, are the global north countries most responsible for driving fossil fuel expansion and most desperate to escape that responsibility. I think it's not a coincidence that coal, as it exists right now, outside of our friends in Australia, is largely being developed in global south countries, in countries with less development, in countries who have historically had less power in spaces like the UN. And so I think oil and gas are more protected. They have more political protection. You've also seen the industry start to turn on itself, and oil and gas have kind of ganged up on coal in a sense. So I think there's some inter-industry dynamics there, but I think it really does get to the question of equity at the heart of all of this. We talk about somebody like the United States, which is massively expanding oil and gas production and then exporting that overseas, trying to replace coal in developing countries. Perhaps that's a short-term solution for the next year or two. This is not a 40, 50-year solution like we're locking in the infrastructure for it to be a long-term solution. It's a recipe for climate disaster, and we're seeing that. And so I think that core question of equity, who will act first, who will act fastest, it was raised before. This is not something where all of our countries can afford to not be net zero until 2050, 2055. We have to be acting so much faster in order to allow the rest of the world to get there by 2050. And so I think this question of equity, who is going to act first and fastest? You have countries like the United States, like Canada, saying fossil fuel profits for me, deadly climate impacts for thee. And I think that is a deadly path to go down. It's one that we're seeing, but I think it's one that we still have a chance to avert if we continue to have that conversation. A great report from the Civil Society Equity Review last week started to dig into this question of supply-side equity. How are we going to be phasing out the supply of fossil fuels? How does that look? What support is needed for a transition and for developing countries? And I think we really need to continue to advance that conversation now that it has a foothold in these talks, now that it is finally, after 26 years, being discussed in real time. We don't have another 26 years, but we have to continue to escalate that discussion, continue to force resolution, and work on all these great initiatives that we've talked about today.
And I want to add 2 quick points on why we're not seeing oil and gas. I think part of it is because of the oil and gas lobby itself. The incredible work of Influence Map shows us that there are 5 companies that have spent $1 billion since Paris in lobbying to weaken climate policy and negotiations to make oil and gas invisible. And part of it is also the millions of dollars in advertising that is spent in all of our countries by the oil and gas industry to fearmonger around price and scarcity. So we still use oil and gas in our lives, and that makes people nervous. But the fact is, we already have more than enough oil and gas under production or construction to use while we transition and phase out. We also now have the technologies at scale, renewable energy and electrification, electric vehicles, etc., in order to phase out most of our uses of oil and gas. But that's not what the oil and gas industry wants governments to think, and they're trying to justify their continued expansion. And so that's part of why we see their heavy political influence here at COP. I think we have time for one more question. And then, Freddie, I'm going to ask, I'm going to go to you for any closing comments about your research. I noticed when I was reading it last night, there are over 150 footnotes in that report. There's a tremendous amount of dense data in it, and I just want to, while we have you virtually, see if you have any final comments that we didn't get to. But first, the last question from the floor. Is that you? Did you have a question?
This might be very provocative, and I hope I don't get accosted for it, but it strikes me that fear is the #1 human motivator. And so if countries were to voluntarily reduce their supply side, this could be viewed as a national security threat. So I'm wondering, is perhaps decarbonizing the military complex in these countries one of the ways to focus on transitioning, because it's always been the military and technological advances, whether it's nuclear power or the space race, that seems to really push technology and advances forward.
Richie, did you want to address the military complex question?
More in terms of basically the concept of fuel security, which I think underpins that, really. And it depends, obviously, which country. Australia, largest coal exporter, largest liquefied natural gas exporter, imports 90% of its liquid fuels. And so in that sense, it is liquid fuel insecure, and that's one of the things that the military in Australia is actually paying a lot of attention to now. So it really depends on which resource and how it all factors in. But when it comes down to the bigger issue about how to use fear, I think we have the cards stacked up against it, because the fossil fuel industry have been using fear to make us afraid of change, and because of that supply side issue. In Australia, for example, there are more people employed in McDonald's than employed in the oil and gas industry, but people think that it's more like 40, 50 times the number. They think the same thing in terms of income. And that's the problem, is that people feel like if they're going to cut their fossil fuel supply, it's not just going to hurt them in terms of their individual needs, but their national needs as well. And until we flip that, until we fix that disinformation, we're always going to have this imbalance. And part of that is calling out the fossil fuel industry when they're spreading this disinformation.
Thank you so much. And the last word to Freddie Daly from Sussex University, who wrote this tremendous report. Freddie.
Thank you, Diaspora. I just wanted to say that everybody's comments on the panel and all the questions really do hit the nail on the head. We need to explicitly address this issue, and we need to acknowledge that fossil fuels are the root cause of the climate crisis we're facing. As the other panelists have said, these 5 countries have the wealth, they have the economic diversity to really move away from fossil fuels and phase them out rapidly and justly. But I'd just like to say, and this is something that I think has come to the fore during this COP in particular, that it's not only that these 5 nations can do it, they must do it. They have an obligation and a duty to do it. These 5, the climate crisis we're facing today, that is killing people, and people are facing loss and damage in the here and now, can be traced back to the industrialization of these nations, to their empires, to their development. So it's on them, and it's not about how they should do it, if they should do it. It's about them. They must do it, and they must start doing it now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Freddie. The perfect closing words. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to our tremendous panelists for all of your work here at COP and your work at home in raising these issues. Thank you to WWF for hosting this rather controversial report and our panel in your pavilion. We thank you very much. Thank you all.